Welcome to Crimson Guitars, welcome to Patrons Questions episode 19. Today I'm going to be answering questions about multi-laminate necks, using different materials and how they react to each other with regards to shrinkage and warping, etc. And I'm also going to be answering a question about how to deal with particularly oily woods. So let us start off. This is a question and a response question from Jason Denson, and then Bizman62 responds to it, so I'll read them both. Jason Denson says, so if you're making a body or neck out of a couple of different types of wood, do you ever worry about different rates of expansion and compression as it pertains to temperature? First mistake, it's not to do with temperature, it's to do with moisture content in the air, and stroke the wood, of course. The temperature does affect that to a certain extent. The colder the air, I think I'm getting this right, the colder the air, the less moisture the air can physically hold. And the warmer the air, the more moisture. So that's why they say, oh, it's 80% humidity today or something like that. At this temperature, the air can only hold about 80% humidity. I'm sure I'm wrong in several key places there, but the gist of it is temperature actually doesn't affect it. Am I splitting hairs here? I'm splitting hairs here. For a bald man, I just shouldn't do that. Okay. I have just recently sandwiched a 1/4-inch slice of purple heart in between some pieces of walnut, and I think the purple heart has shrunk on me. I grant you it is almost imperceptible, but it did bring up the question, especially when we are adding all of these different woods on as tops. And then Bizman62 says, yes, that's a question I'd like to be addressed. Multi-laminates with several different woods as 2 to 20 mil slices. Do they cause issues, or are the changes insignificant? It depends. I hate people who say that. It very much depends on how good the wood is when it starts. I, wherever possible, will leave wood drying for as long as possible. And especially if it's a build that I know has got a multi-laminate neck, I will take those pieces of wood, roughly thickness them to almost the thickness that I require, and then I will put them in Tonehenge downstairs where they both species of wood will be in the same place, hopefully reaching their equilibrium at that temperature, but before they're actually glued together. Because, as you say, stuff moves. If you have wood that's been stored outside or in your shed, and you've got some wood that's just come from a timber supplier who's been storing it in a warehouse, and some other wood that's coming from a luthier supply house that actually kiln dries stuff, etc., etc., etc. You've got 3 different pieces of wood that are trying to get used to their new atmosphere, and they are going to move and twist, shrink, take on moisture sometimes, depending on the atmosphere they're in. Once they are glued together, because you're super excited about your build and you want to get it on, if they're glued together, there is the potential for twisting, or possibly what Jason says here is 1/4-inch slice of purple heart in between some pieces of walnut, and he thinks the purple heart has shrunk. That's very unlikely. Purple heart is hard as hell. What's more likely is that the walnut has taken on a little bit of moisture and expanded just a fraction. You can see this on production guitars, cheaper production guitars, where you've got a body made out of 3 or 4 different slices of wood, and you can see through the paint, you can see where the joints are, where some of it's taken on more moisture or some of it's lost moisture, etc. And it does happen. Most hobby builders spend a relatively long period of time building the guitar. And as long as the wood has reached some sort of equilibrium, if you're in a huge rush, a couple of weeks, leave it a couple of weeks. If you've got the time, leave it a couple of months. Or if you have a big timber store and you can afford it, yeah, years are better. But as long as they are at equilibrium with each other and have stopped moving, then you can plane the material down to the final thickness you want and glue it together, and then leave it again for a little while and see if it's going to move. And it's the same. It's the same with solid neck blanks, to be honest. Cut it down to roughly the size you want, set it aside after measuring it and seeing if it's twisted or moved or what it looks like. Remember that. Go back in 2 weeks' time and see if it's twisted or moved. The ideal way to make a guitar neck is to do that. You've got the material, it's nice and dry. You cut it roughly to a neck blank size, but with 4 or 5 or 6 millimeters oversized in each dimension, so that if it does twist, you can plane the twist out. Leave it for a couple of weeks, see if it moves, or longer. If it does move, plane it out, set it aside, see if it moves. If it hasn't moved, move on to the next stage. Carve it, set it aside, leave it, see if it's going to twist or move or shrink or what. Sometimes wood has compression built into it, so you cut it and it's just going to go doing, and that would, yeah, you see that immediately, but sometimes it's slightly slower. Time. It really does take time to build a guitar properly and safely. Now, as an example, I built 2 neck blanks. I used to take a custom order, build a neck blank big enough to make 2 or 3 guitars, and then make the guitar and save the neck blank. And there's one particular time I remember making the neck blank, building a guitar, sending it off, multi-laminate neck, going off to the States where it was particularly dry. And the guy came back and said, well, I'm sorry, this neck is twisted. And it took me 6 months to build the guitar. The twist didn't really happen, but I was working out of a shed that didn't have very good moisture content control. It was a chicken shed in the end, actually. And it turns out that I had thought all the wood was dry, but one of the, I think, 3 woods that was in that neck, pretty sure was Purple Heart and Zebrano and something else, actually. One of the woods was really wet, actually, and those 2 stringers had really moved. And I took the blank that I still had and looked at this big 4-inch by 3-inch thick blank, and that whole blank had twisted because I had wood that was not at the same sorry, somebody trying to come through the door. You can come, it's fine. It's only our patrons, our most important people that follow us. And that's the thing. I'm going to pause this and deal with Tom here and get back to you, but that's it. Make sure the wood is dry and in the same atmosphere in order to work. Otherwise, you will have problems. And take your time. I will be back for the next half of this. Sorry about that. I don't get interrupted very often, but when I do, it's a doozy. Okay, so that was it. There can be issues, but the upshot is, with a multi-laminate neck, if it is stable, it's more stable. And yeah, you can build that stability in. This is another question. This is from Aaron Mix. He says, I just bought some catalogs to build a couple of multi-laminate necks. To build a couple multi-laminate necks out of, which I'm really excited about, as it's harder than ebony at less than half the price. I've never actually heard of this stuff. However, it is a very dense and oily wood, and I'm worried about gluing it successfully. After all, it won't matter if it's the strongest wood in the world if it delaminates. Explosive delamination. Any advice would be appreciated. Love the channel and thanks. That's a pleasure. Thanks for your support. Okay. I now want to explosively delaminate some necks. Tests. Always, 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 always practice as much as humanly possible and see what it does. Particularly oily woods, one quick and relatively easy way to counter that, and one that we use a lot, is acetone. Acetone, if you're in the UK or Europe, I suppose. Naphtha, if you're in the States. I'm pretty sure it's roughly the same stuff with just different brand names, but I don't know. But that will dissolve the oil. Can you tell I'm slightly distracted now? That will dissolve the oil and hopefully give you a good neck joint, or a good joint, sorry. That really is the most important thing and the first thing, but really seriously, use the naphtha, use the, crikey. Clean the oil off with that. Lighter fluid even works as well sometimes. Let that dry for a little bit, but not long enough for it to come through. For example, I have this camphor here, and we really struggled to get this camphor dry because it had so much oil in it that it seeped out of the ends and sealed the end grain, stopping the moisture transfer out of the wood. Now, with a particularly oily wood, you do the joint relatively rapidly after you've cleaned off the oil with naphtha, etc. Because you don't want that oil to then seep back out and ruin the joint. Do some tests. I've found it's less of an issue with bigger surfaces. I'm not sure if it's to do with the end grain or the long grain, etc. I have less experience, I must say, working with oily woods. I'm trying to remember the name of a particular timber. Amboina burl, there we go. That is apparently particularly oily. And I used some on the scratch plate for that S-type kit that I built. The what do they call it? Slushious. That was, I'm pretty sure I jointed that and I used naphtha for that. If I didn't, then it was because I was thinking about doing that. But anyway, it's one of those things, you can get away with it. It is not insurmountable. I have been told that polyurethane glue is particularly good for oily woods as well. Now, we know long grain to long grain polyurethane isn't as good as some, but it depends on how big the joint is. If it's a neck, if you're making a multi-laminate neck, polyurethane is actually a pretty damn good glue to use. As long as you've got the joint right, clean the oil off, as I've said, and use polyurethane glue, and that should give you a really super strong joint. And that's all I have to say about that. If any of you have experience with this wood, or with particularly oily woods more than I have, please let us know in the comments below. But I would say between those two things, you're pretty much set to have ebony-like strength at half the price. And yeah, hopefully very pretty too. So, thank you for watching. Don't click like and subscribe, because you have subscribed. In fact, you are supporters. I'm going to go and deal with this issue that has come up and slightly distracted me. And I will be back soon. Thank you for being awesome. I will, yeah. Do I have any more to film today? I've got guitars to build and videos to make. It's 11:10 and I have at least another 5 videos to make today at length. Great fun. I'll see you soon. Goodbye.